I'd like to welcome all of you to the third business forum of the 2017-2018 season. Today's business forum is also a live program that's being aired on Queens Public Television. We're really pleased to have such a great turnout this morning for our panel discussion on sustainability. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our corporate sponsors this season, Farrell Fritz, PricewaterhouseCoopers, New York Presbyterian Queens, and SCORE New York metro areas. And can we all give them a round of applause? I'd also like to thank our community sponsors, Borough President Melinda Katz, the Queens Chamber of Commerce, the Queens Economic Development Corporation, Queens Public Television, the Queens Tribune and Press, and the Daily News. These forums are presented solely through the generous donations of our sponsors and make the forum possible, as well as the scholarship that we award each year in June, so at our next event. If any of you are interested in supporting the forums, we suggest a nominal donation of $25, and they can be given to anyone outside at the reception table. So now is the part where I would normally introduce President Matos Rodriguez. However, he is lobbying on behalf of the CUNY budget, which I think is an excellent thing for him to be doing. And so I'm going to pinch hit and brag about Queens College on his behalf. First of all, let me thank Dean Michael Wolf and his staff for organizing today's event on such an important topic. We're pleased to welcome you to Queens College this morning. Now in our 80th year, celebrating our 80th anniversary year, we continue our tradition of providing affordable access to public higher education. Queens College was recently ranked in the top 10 public universities in the whole country for moving low-income students into the middle class. 80% of our students graduate debt-free, and we know that 90% of those who graduate in 4 years graduate debt-free. So last fall, we rolled out our QCN4 four-year graduation guarantee. We're the only school in New York City to have such a guarantee, and we're very pleased with it. Now we are introducing accelerated master's programs, so not only will the students get through in 4 years, but they can get a jump on their graduate education as well. Queens College is committed to sustainability, both in our campus and in our facilities operation, and through our educational programs. We have the largest earth and environmental science program in CUNY. Our faculty are active with federal, state, and city agencies and community groups and addressing environmental issues. Just to mention a couple of things. The Queens Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to mention especially President Tom Gretsch and Marshall Hameson of the Energy Committee, in addition to sponsoring our business forum, is a strong partner with Queens College in bringing town to gown, helping to form relationships between the college and the wider community to promote community education and engage our technical expertise in addressing community problems. One of our classes is working with local business owners to help them develop photovoltaic plans. Professor Greg O'Mullen, chair of our School of Earth and Environmental Science, who's here today, is working on cleanup of the Hudson River with the New York Department of Conservation, Riverkeeper, and the US EPA, and has helped these organizations transform the Hudson from an industrial sewer to a swimmable river. More recently, he and Professor John Waldman, who's also here today, have worked with Riverkeeper to develop a visioning plan for redevelopment of the Flushing Bay waterfront to restore habitat and clean water and increase public access to nature, the natural environment, and the waterfront. The Barry Commoner Center for Health and the Environment is a national expert on identifying environmental causes of health problems, including the association of diesel vehicle emissions as a cause of asthma in children. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize a special supporter of the college and the forum, Jackie Astobi, who's a distinguished alumna of Queens College and recently retired as Vice President and Director at PricewaterhouseCoopers after a 35-year career. She received her BA in accounting, graduating magna cum laude with honors in 1977. She has long contributed to her alma mater, serving on our business advisory board since inception in 2008, and we're happy she's going to keep doing that even after her retirement. And she was instrumental in bringing PwC in as a sponsor of the Business Forum and has been actively involved with us from the beginning. She's been a tireless advocate for our accounting students, many of whom she helped to bring to PwC. So many now that there's a special chapter of the PwC chapter of Young Alumni who mentor our students. All of us at Queens College want to thank Jackie for all she's done and will continue to do for our students, by recognizing her contributions with a small gift. So, Jackie. The small gift was stuck in the traffic on the Grand Central, which I gather quite a few other people were as well. Thank you, Laurie. So, on behalf of Queens College, thank you so much.
Just a quick thank you. It really has been my pleasure to come back to Queens College and work with students. It's like a second home to me. And I'd like to tell a story that I've told a few of the professors. When I started in public accounting at PwC, some of the staff assigned to my job just basically wanted my job, but didn't really work. And I went into HR and I said, you know, if we had some Queens College students, they work hard, they have jobs, and they still do great in school. And our HR department says, then go to Queens College and hire them. And that's what I've been doing for 35 years, and probably over the years, we've hired about 350 accounting students at PwC. I want to thank the faculty, the Career Development Office, and all the Queens College administrators for supporting me and what I do here for the college. Thank you.
And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Dean Michael Wolf. Michael is Dean of our Division of Social Sciences and a professor in the History Department. Prior to coming to Queens College in 2015, Michael served as graduate dean at our neighbor St. John's University, and prior to that spent nearly 20 years on the faculty at Penn State University. He's a specialist in medieval and Renaissance European history and has published or edited 8 books, including studies of medieval environments and urban history. While at Penn State, he helped to develop an interdisciplinary environmental studies program where he collaborated with faculty in the natural sciences, engineering, social science, and the humanities. A native of New England, he received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University and a master's from Boston University. Please join me in welcoming him and our distinguished panelists, whom Michael will now introduce.
Thank you. Thank you, Provost Hendry. Very happy to be here and welcome you all. Renewable energy, an efficient transportation system, clean air, water, waste reduction, recycling, resiliency, and climate change. These aspects and more make up the urban sustainability agenda that citizens and businesses in New York City and upstate, as well as across our country and around the world, must take up to ensure that our communities and all who live in them today, tomorrow, and into the future can thrive. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists this morning, who will explore and discuss the subject of sustainability in the city. Over the next hour or so, I'll ask them questions that touch on essential features of the urban sustainability agenda, what it means for our residential and business communities, leaving time at the end for questions and answers from the audience. Today's panelists are, to my right, Rob Crowder-Roof, who is the CEO and founder of Crowder-Roof and Associates, who brings more than a decade of experience advancing green economic development projects in New York City and across the nation. Prior to founding his company, he successfully led the New York City-based Stormwater Infrastructure Matters Coalition's efforts to advance the city's $1 billion plus green infrastructure plan. He's an internationally recognized expert in green infrastructure and recipient of numerous awards. Rob holds a master's degree in city planning from MIT and a BA from Columbia University. Anel Hernandez, to my left, immediate, is the resiliency planner with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. She currently works on both city and statewide climate policy issues, focusing on local advocacy that furthers equitable investments in coastal protections, green infrastructure, and renewable energy. She also works on various coalition campaigns to push for more aggressive climate legislation with equity as a central focus. Previously, she worked at Columbia University's Earth Institute and in the city's mayor's office as a social innovation fund advisor. Anel received an MPA in Energy and Environment from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs and a BA in Political Science and Latino Studies from Fordham. Jesse Scott, on my furthest left here, is the manager for business development and program manager for the Five Cities program at the New York Power Authority. In his role, Jesse is the liaison between the cities of Albany, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Yonkers, and program stakeholders. He also provides support for the K-Solar and Build Smart New York programs and performs business development for NYPA's Customer Energy Solutions division. Prior to joining NYPA, Jesse worked as a project consulting manager at Lockheed Martin and as an energy consultant. He is a certified energy manager and is currently pursuing his MBA in management at UConn. And finally, to my furthest right here is Tria Case, my colleague in CUNY. Tria is the University Director of Sustainability and Energy Conservation at CUNY. Since 2006, she has led the development and implementation of multiple federal, state, and city projects that fund solar programs on behalf of New York City and the state, leading to significant growth in solar capacity and installation companies. In the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, TRIA formed the Smart Distributed Generation Hub with city, state, and federal participation. In addition, she coordinates and provides resources to CUNY's 24 institutions of higher education to meet the goal of reducing CUNY's energy consumption through sustainable CUNY Conserves programs. Tria received her undergraduate degree from Union College and earned her JD from Brooklyn Law School. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. So as we begin our conversation, I would like to ask each panelist to begin by giving us a sense of the perspective and priorities that they bring to the subject of urban sustainability. And I'd like to start with Jesse and work our way down this way. So take 2 or 3 minutes if you would.
Sure, thank you, Michael. So the program I was brought on to run at the New York Power Authority, or NYPA, it's called the Five Cities program. And what we did was, starting in 2012, started creating city energy plans for the 5 largest cities in the state outside of New York City, which is Albany, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, and Yonkers. They're the 5 largest cities outside of New York City in the state of New York by population. And when we started this plan, there was no such thing as smart cities. And I think if we did this again today, the plans would look much different. But we released those plans in 2015. And the first component of the plan that we wanted to put in place was hiring energy managers for cities. And that was a concept that none of these cities had ever considered before. There were planning departments and DPW departments. But we wanted the cities to start looking at energy differently. So we helped, the Power Authority supported getting these energy managers in place, and we've been up and running. The program's been going since 2015. Since then, we've done installations in over 200 buildings across the 5 cities, installed over 40,000 LED tubes or fixtures across the 5 cities. And the biggest component of what we're doing is reinvestment. So the money that they're saving from projects they're doing now, they're dedicating to a revolving energy fund, and they're reinvesting into future projects so that they can sustain themselves on the road. It's very important. Another program that the Power Authority just announced about a month ago with the governor is Smart Street Lighting NY, and I'd love to talk about that a little bit later on. That program has a goal of converting 500,000 streetlights in New York State to LED by 2025. Here in New York City, there are about 300,000 streetlights. New York City was one of the first large cities in the country to convert to LED. It was fantastic. The rest of the state has a lot of catching up to do. We think only about 10% of the streetlights across the state outside of New York City have been converted to LED, and that's a problem. We have a lot of catching up to do. We have issues with utility ownership versus municipal ownership. So that's an exciting program that we're working very closely with the governor's office to implement and to propel outside of New York City, the rest of the state, to catch up to implement some of the lessons learned that New York City already did a few years ago. So that's really exciting. We're looking forward to that.
Great, thanks. Mel.
Hi, everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my organization. We were founded in 1991 with the mission of linking the struggles of environmental justice communities throughout New York City, really to fight back against the environmental injustices and environmental burdens faced by these communities. So, we have organizations in the South Bronx and in North Brooklyn that face similar issues around the siting of power plants or the location of waste transfer stations that really impacts public health in those communities. And, you can see that there's a lot of disproportionate asthma rates and other issues that these communities have. And so, we worked mainly on waste issues when we got started and really transitioned to working on brownfields, community gardens, climate legislation, and environmental justice accountability, making sure that low-income people and people of color are at the table when a lot of these decisions are being made. And more recently, we've really focused more on renewable energy and energy resiliency. How can we make sure that everyone is benefiting from all of these new investments and transition away from fossil fuels? And I'm happy to talk, about all of those issues. Well, our role is just to support neighborhood-based priorities and to really sit at the city's table to make sure that those are being heard. And we always say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So you got to make sure that you're at the table.
Having worked in restaurants a long time, I can really understand that. So maybe hand it off to Rob.
And I run Crowder Roof and Associates. We're a consultancy based in New York that develops green systems for multifamily housing, property owners, and communities throughout the city. For ground-up construction, then we focus on value-driven landscape design, providing a full set of landscape design services that targets the DEP's Green Infrastructure Grant Program that can fund the full capital cost of projects. And then for existing buildings and neighborhoods, then we provide comprehensive planning, site suitability analysis across types of technology, green infrastructure, solar PV, solar thermal, battery storage, develop master plans and creative financing strategies, and then serve as owner's representative to realize projects. So I think three words that encapsulate what we do. We're the implementation. We're the implementation partner to a lot of property owners. Innovation. We look at creative financing to capture as much value for the property owner and communities as possible, and then scale. So while we work on an individual building scale, our goal ultimately is the campus and neighborhood scale.
Good morning. So thank you, Michael, for organizing this, and thank you, Queens College, for inviting all of us here. It's great to be sitting on a panel with folks who are making a difference here in New York City. So CUNY, we're 500,000 people, we're 30 million square feet, we're 300 buildings, we're 1% of the city's electrical load. So we recognize that we have a responsibility to help the city and help the state be more sustainable wherever we can. We've been really focusing in three key areas. First, of course, is internally in our own buildings, looking at opportunities for energy efficiency. We have programs where we're looking at how we can reduce our loads, our peaks, so that we can make sure that when our local grids are finding that during those summer days they're having a hard time meeting the needs, that we're there at the front end trying to shut off lights and shut down our equipment in ways that allow us to continue the educational process, but also support the grid where we can. We also have a revolving fund similar to what was just described at NYPA, where we are supporting campuses to invest in energy efficiency projects and then being able to use those savings to invest in future energy savings projects. And Queens College has been a leader in utilizing that fund and also in the energy efficiency programs that we've been running. So thank you, Bill and Zico, for being here and for all the great work that you're doing. The second sort of pillar area that we work on is around solar energy. And we really looked around the city. We looked at our buildings. We looked at the million buildings across the city of New York and said, where's the solar? Why, we certainly have plenty of rooftops. About a decade ago, there was maybe under a megawatt of solar across the city and maybe a couple hundred installations at best. Since then, and we'll talk about this more later, we've been able to help grow that marketplace to, we're with what's in the queue, almost at 200 megawatts and thousands of installations across the city, in addition to thousands of jobs that have been created across the city. And the third area is really around resiliency with a focus on battery storage. And in that arena, we're working closely with our partners at the city and at the state to try to think about how we can leverage battery storage. What are the ways that we can integrate that into the marketplace by working with Department of Buildings and fire departments to create permitting processes, to try to streamline that process in a safe way, in a transparent way, and be able to use that battery storage to back up renewable energy so that those intermittent resources can be used as more of our energy baseline. So those three areas have been the pillars of our focus, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we've been doing that going on.
Great, thank you. I think just to sort of encapsulate, I mean, all these different perspectives come together, and I think must be considered as we think about urban sustainability issues. I sometimes characterize them as the 4 E's of environment, economics, education, and equity that we have to always keep in mind. But I think also before we get further along, I think we need to note the absence on the panel of anyone really coming out of the world of science. I know we have our faculty here, but I think we should begin with science in this conversation. And I would like to ask each of the panels to give us a sense of how the science informs what they do, even though we know that there is some doubt occasionally cast upon it. So if you could relate to us what science is telling us about the need for urban sustainability, are there grounds for doubt, and what are the risks of ignoring the findings of science? So I might begin with Rob on that question.
Thank you. Well, there's the hard sciences, right? Which we all know climate change is real. There's a lot of baseline facts that we just need to start the conversation about. One example of how science has informed green infrastructure is around the fact that about 15 years ago, when I started doing this work in the city, then green infrastructure was really not seen as infrastructure by the New York City Department of Environmental Protection. We met with commissioners and other decision makers in the mayor's office, and they said, well, you need just use concrete tanks to meet regulatory requirements, Clean Water Act, where the city is going to put billions of dollars, and then we'll eventually do some pilot projects for a green roof here and there, right? And there's a lot of science in other parts of the country and some from New York saying, well, landscape catches water. Plants use water. And here's how and why that works. And it wound up taking a real advocacy effort where we worked with, so it's not just, there's a hard science and then there's behavioral science, right? How do we as individuals, as groups and institutions make decisions to adopt new infrastructure, new ideas? So in this case, we went to City Council. And first we formed a coalition of about 100 groups throughout the city, SWIM, Stormwater Infrastructure Matters, and developed a platform. Then we went to City Council and drafted legislation with them and say, here's what a sustainable stormwater management plan should look like. And that plan was passed through City Council in 2009 that was implemented by the mayor's office and used the hard science from a pilot project in Jamaica Bay, as well as economic analysis. And really, of this 200-page study, the main conclusion is green infrastructure can be a cost-effective alternative to gray infrastructure. And then that was adopted by the DEP a couple years later. So there's the hard science. You can have the best hard science in the world, but it needs to somehow translate into behavioral change. And so this $1 billion commitment by the city is a testament to how the hard science can become a reality.
As a historian, I can certainly sympathize with the difficulties of behavioral change among human beings, so I appreciate that. I'd like to ask Anel to give us her perspective.
Great. Yeah, I guess I'll start off by saying that there's two important ways to look at it. There's the environmental burdens that are causing a lot of public health impacts from this fossil fuel infrastructure. And then there's the climate impacts that we will be facing. So it's coming at you from both sides. And there's a lot of research out there, a lot of scientific data that's constantly being collected, public health data that really shows all of this. And last week, I had the chance to go to Canada for the international panel on climate change, focused specifically on cities where thousands of academics, scientists, nonprofit organizations, practitioners came together to share everything, share all of the information, all of their experiences. And it's true not just in New York, it's true everywhere. And that science is definitely a fact. It's not something that we should be doubting at this point. And the way that we use science in our job is really through spatial analysis. So we look at all of the storm surge data to see what parts of New York City are the most vulnerable. And one of the things that we found is that all of our industrial areas, called the significant maritime and industrial areas in New York, they're across the whole city, are all in flood zones. And so that means that all of these potentially polluting chemicals and other types of materials are going into our waterways and then potentially coming back and affecting residents and workers in these industrial zones. So, based on that information, we started all of these projects and outreach to work with local businesses in these industrial areas to make sure that they have best management strategies to deal with storm surge, and to really figure out what the risks are exactly. And that's just one example. We've also looked at the vulnerabilities of public buildings and how many of them also lie in a storm surge zone. One really critical one that should make all New Yorkers nervous is that our food distribution center that provides food for the entire region, not just the city, lies in a flood zone. So what happens during the next Hurricane Sandy? And so we've been working in a multi-year advisory working group with the city to make sure that the food distribution center sees not just coastal protection, but also backup power to make sure that all of our food doesn't go bad during an extreme weather event or any sort of emergency.
Great, thank you. Maybe Tria?
Sure. So I certainly would echo much of what we just heard. The behavioral science piece is incredibly interesting and requires bringing everybody to the table. And in some ways, we found trying to make it easier for people to do the right thing is a key component of that. How I may want to reduce my energy use, but how do I go about doing that? I may want to leverage renewable energy, but how do I do that? And how do I make sure I do that in the most cost-effective way? So on the CUNY side, we've been looking at deploying IT tools. So developing informational emails that might go out to energy managers or facility managers to let them know that their building is about to hit a peak. And if I know that I'm about to hit that peak and I can use an IT tool to help me do that, maybe I can react quickly enough to reduce my energy use. And that's not only going to reduce energy use, but it's going to save money for the campus in this instance, and that hopefully can get turned around and spent on other things. The other piece is utilizing building management systems. So many of our buildings now, they're being built with very smart infrastructure, and making sure that we know how to utilize that, making sure that it's being programmed in the right way so that we are creating a healthier atmosphere, indoor atmosphere for folks to learn in, that we are, again, being as efficient as we can is important, and it's something that we can do. The tools are there, we just have to be able to utilize them. The other piece, and this is something that I think we're going to see grow exponentially in the coming years is the utilization of technology and the science coming out around battery storage. We're just starting to see a exponential growth of lithium-ion batteries here in the United States. New York City is just developing a permitting process now for lithium-ion batteries. CUNY's at the table with the fire department and the Department of Buildings trying to help make that happen. When that happens, I think we're going to see, again, exponential growth of renewables, and we're going to be able to rely less on fossil fuels. And I think that is going to make a huge impact in terms of climate change. So there's a lot that we can do utilizing science and leveraging that sort of behavioral science component to help folks understand what's possible. You can have the best widget in the world, but if you can't put it into the marketplace and people don't know what it is or how to use it, it's going to sit on a shelf. So wrapping that is a really important piece of the work.
And one of the people who helps put these things on the shelf, certainly for the state of New York, is Jesse. So now.
Yeah, so from a regulatory perspective from the state, we can implement policies that encourage hardening the grid. Initiatives like REV, Reimagining the Energy Vision, are preparing the grid for future catastrophes. We can also contribute funding to help harden the grid. As Tree was talking about battery storage, microgrids and a program like the NYSERDA New York Prize program is encouraging communities around the state to install microgrids so they are not entirely dependent on the utility grid. From a utility perspective, it started with Sandy and then Puerto Rico and most recently these snowstorms. We still have linesmen down in Puerto Rico, and the stories they came back with were absolutely horrifying. The grid was created over 100 years ago. It's not prepared to handle future weather events like we've been experiencing. So hardening the grid through distributed generation is something we're working on from a policy level and an implementation level. And then as far as resources, just making sure that we're better prepared for future storms. There were residents in Westchester last week that had power out for over a week from a snowstorm that really wasn't that bad. So we need better training, we need preparation and communication, and those are things that we can do from a utility and regulatory perspective to help us be better prepared for the future.
Thank you. That kind of sets the stage, I think, for the next question, which for our panelists, we in advance prepared some questions. I'm going to try to combine the next two, in fact. And thinking about ask them, maybe beginning with Anel, how New York City is doing in terms of the urban sustainability agenda, and try to put it in context with what's going on in other cities that they're familiar with. Again, maybe start with Anel. How are we doing?
I'll say we're doing okay. I'll start by saying that what New York City does is always very important because every city in America and internationally tends to look at what New York is doing. And, I think that New York is good at making announcements and press releases, but, the difficult part is when you're implementing these programs and how they're being implemented. And really that's what we focus on in our organization because we want to make sure that these new investments are happening equitably. And I'll just give one example of a particular initiative. The city announced that they wanted to do 100 megawatts of solar energy on our public buildings. So anything from a public school to a library to a fire department to a wastewater treatment plant, to really begin to work toward the emission reduction goals of 80% by 2050. And this was a great announcement. We were like, wow, this is amazing. But then once we started looking, into the details, that's when the problems popped up. A lot of schools were being left behind because their roof hadn't been repaired in 20 years. And so they didn't qualify for solar. They weren't solar ready. And where are these schools located? Mostly in low-income communities. So that was the first flag for us. Secondly, the city wasn't doing it with labor unions. And so in a lot of our coalitions, we work with economic justice groups, we work with labor unions because we acknowledge that, all of these issues are intertwined. You can't talk about the environment without talking about the people. So that was the second flag. Okay, how is this not being done with labor unions on a public school, on a public building? And so we pushed the city on both of this. We worked with the city council to have an oversight hearing to push the city to really think through how they're implementing this program. And we were very successful in really pushing them. We got them to enact like an environmental justice working group, and now they have to present their work to us every quarter to make sure that, you know, they're on track and they're implementing it well. They also did a cost-benefit analysis to better understand how labor unions can provide this work for the city, and it's, you know, more a better equitable way to do it. And, you know, it's really exciting. We've seen a lot of buildings already receive solar, and then the next round, they're also focusing on energy storage, as Tria mentioned. And a lot of buildings that are in storm surge zones are getting backup power, getting this renewable energy and energy storage, which is really important from our perspective because it's about community preparedness. How do you make sure that a hurricane evacuation center will have power no matter what happens, and that's really critical. So it's not just about reducing emissions, it's also, again, about protecting the people.
Great, thanks. Yeah, on this, a lot of the projects that you're mentioning, and I think, Rob, you're probably very familiar with that in terms of how the city, from your angle, is doing. So could you give us a little bit of your perspective on that?
Sure. On the green infrastructure side, then for private property, there's a very, very small share of the city's green infrastructure budget that's allocated right now. If I were to do the math, it's probably less than 1% or so. It's almost all been in the public right-of-way, streets and sidewalks and so on. And so the grant program's funded maybe 40 to 50 projects. Queens College has been a recipient of a couple of them, so we're on a campus of a leader here, but it's not enough, right? And some of that comes down to the source of funding. Right? The source is capital dollars, and the Office of Management and Budget has said you need very, very tight restrictions on that. Property owners need to make very particular restrictions to access that funding. So that funding is best suited for schools and hospitals, some private property owners, condo associations, but it does not access, for example, affordable housing very well. So there needs to be different funding sources, such as expense dollars that are more discretionary and have fewer strings attached, but could still be implemented in a meaningful way to make sure that, say, a green roof that's built on a building remains there for 20 years. So last year, for example, we accessed more than $1 million of grant funding for our clients, including a pilot, about $500,000 as a pilot for an affordable housing property owner in the Bronx, a ground-up development project that was a partnership between the City Housing and Preservation Department and the Department of Environmental Protection. It was the first time that an agreement had been made so that green infrastructure was tied into the financing project process and the closing of a development deal in the city for affordable housing. So that's a big deal, and it's a precedent that can and should be scaled. One other aspect that I'd like to quickly touch on is a lot of leadership is coming from the state on these in terms of sustainability, especially in the energy space. We secured $200,000 last year for a client of ours. We're retrofitting a portfolio of about 100 buildings in central Brooklyn through a NYSERDA grant program that's dedicated for affordable housing and community development. It's a pre-development grant program, which was a huge gap. When we started doing this work, there wasn't funding available to kickstart new ideas in a way that would be able to really help to transform the market, especially in sectors that are underserved. So that grant program, NYSERDA is also developing it, is increasing their incentive for solar in affordable housing starting in the next month or two. These are major improvements in terms of policies and practices for sustainability.
Great. I think as you mentioned that, Rob, I'm thinking maybe I'll kick it over to Jesse here in terms because he brought it from the city out to the state, and and talk a little bit about how you're doing and why the state's becoming such a leader in this.
I would echo Neil and say New York City is doing okay. But I'll qualify that. NRDC did a study last year and said New York City is number 2 in the country for large cities in terms of sustainability and energy efficiency. But they only got a 70 out of 100. So it's a C, but they're the second best leading city in the country after Boston. New York City's done a lot. They've had energy efficiency programs for over 15 years. You guys remember the Con Ed Green Team. Hundreds of thousands of energy efficiency projects have taken place already in across the 5 boroughs of New York City. Tremendous work and progress and effort. Local Law 87 benchmarking requirements. These were groundbreaking initiatives that were put into place over the Bloomberg administration. We're trying to get the rest of the state to follow the model that New York City has put forth. It's very difficult, though. New York City has the luxury of having full occupancy in a lot of neighborhoods. When other cities try to implement regulations, it deters businesses from coming to their communities. So they're a little hesitant to be as ambitious as New York City is. New York City has a responsibility to do more. They are doing more. We're excited to see what the future brings. There's a lot of agencies in New York City doing their own independent initiatives, and there's other initiatives like Build Smart New York, which was a state with also some New York City's agencies like CUNY involved, where they set a goal of a 20% EUI reduction by 2020 from a 2012 baseline. So far, they're at about 15% of the 20%, so they're 3/4 of the way there. Doesn't mean we need to settle with with the progress that we've made so far. The governor is doubling down in light of the Paris Accord. It's now cities and states' responsibility to make up the difference. You'll see some greenhouse gas emission goals coming out over the next few weeks for Earth Day. But it's the cities and states where regulation can be put in place to make change happen. So as a leader across not just New York State, but across the country, New York City, I believe is on track and has a bright future ahead.
Thank you. As I ask Tria to address this issue, I'd like maybe for her to try to focus a little bit on it because it's going to set up the next part on process. One of the things that has been noted here is the way in which the city, the state, public authorities lead their issues, of course, as Anel was pointing out in terms of equity there, but this gap between that and also trying to mobilize the business community and investment community, and this gets back to, I guess, behavioral issues. For CUNY, I mean, are we studying that program as a problem or that issue in the various pilots and various projects that you're involved with? How is that relationship working in the city, accounting for our success or challenges, or are other places doing it better? So,
well, I would say that if we can go back to the solar example, when we first started looking at developing a solar market in New York City, there were maybe 6 businesses in the city supporting that marketplace. Today, there's probably 300, and there's over 2,300 at last count solar jobs here in the city. But at the same time, the payback or the cost of solar has been coming down, and that's why we've been seeing exponential growth and why we're seeing more and more building owners deciding to go solar, including CUNY. So I think we're seeing that the case, and I think you were saying this a little bit too, that the case for making green infrastructure or investments in renewables speaks for itself, because the finances end up telling us what we need to know, which is that the payback is pretty good, especially when you start to fold in the concepts of resiliency. If you're without power for a week and you're a business, that's gonna not be so good for your bottom line. But if you can invest in a battery and you can invest in solar, not only are you going to reduce your monthly overhead costs, but when the power goes out, you're going to have power. And you're not going to be reliant on trying to find that fuel truck when your generator is starting to run out of fuel. And that is something that happened to folks during Hurricane Sandy. And when you start getting to a week of without power, that's what you're going to see. So I think we're starting to see more and more businesses both adopting energy efficiency, renewable energy technologies, and we're seeing more and more businesses go into that marketplace. So it's actually an incredible economic development story for the city of New York and for the state of New York. And I would add to the conversation about goals and setting goals. The city has set a goal for 1,000 megawatts of solar by 2030 and 100 megawatt hours of battery storage by 2020. So those are real goals, and they are goals that require working with the permitting agencies, and this is something that it's kind of the less sexy part of the conversation, but at the end of the day, to get those technologies into our vertical city, it requires permitting, it requires interconnection into the grid, and those are things that have to be figured out in order to make it easy and reduce those, what we call balance of systems, costs of those technologies. And that's what's happening. And the city has been incredibly dedicated to making that happen, as has the state across municipalities that our colleague from NYPA talked about as well.
Thank you very much. I think right now I'd like to maybe take up the unsexy part that you were referencing there, Tria. And that really is, it seems we know the science, what the science tells us. We know what happens if we don't pay attention to the science. We know there are solutions. We know there are techniques and technologies, working models. But a lot of the struggles, and I think this came across in our conversations prior to the panel, is really trying to make sure that we create a process of bringing together all the different groups and different interests to make for effective solutions that can then scale, which is a point that Rob has made especially. So I would like to perhaps begin with Jesse here on this question. What does it take to, what does a successful urban sustainability plan or agenda look like? What really has to go into it to really, what's the recipe? What's the magic recipe?
So I would say first you need a plan, like we did with the 5 cities. I would encourage anybody to go to the Power Authority's website. Those plans are public and posted. There's a lot of great initiatives in those plans that can be replicated, not just in other communities, but in your own businesses and your own homes as well. So I would say take a look at those plans. There's a lot of good information in there. But also, you can't manage what you don't measure. TRIA and the CUNY team have a fantastic energy management and tracking data analytics system. The Power Authority has something similar called New York Energy Manager. So you have to understand the energy that you're using down to the equipment level so you can manage and save energy. The Power Authority is just right now wrapping up a project here on this campus where we're installing meters on every single building. And that's water meters, gas meters, electric meters, down to the equipment level. So they can take that data, put it back into the CUNY central system that every other CUNY building feeds into, and they can know what's going on right now in the ballroom of the student center at Queens College. Oh yeah, there's a breakfast symposium now, so the lights should be on. But that's how you manage, and you have to get down to that level of detail, and you need to pay attention. Somebody has to look at the data. Having that data available is only as good as the paper it's written on or the computer system it's plugged into. If nobody's looking at it and making modifications. So I would say just understanding, how your buildings and equipment are working and managing it properly.
But with that, I would like to invite any questions from our audience. We have one microphone in the back.
Hello, good morning. My name is Cindy Flores. I just had a question for Rob. Earlier, you said that funding for green infrastructure is usually less accessible to public housing, and I just wanted to know, what would be some, I don't know, solutions to that? Like, what other alternatives do people have to access these fundings, and why exactly is it why is it so challenging? Why is it such a hard area?
Sure. Good question. So first to differentiate, so public housing, now DEP has a program with NYCHA to green its facilities. So what I'm referring to are privately owned properties that are owned by nonprofits, that are funded by city, state, and federal funds, ensuring affordability, right? So it's nonprofit affordable housing. And the city requires an agreement that essentially other city agencies won't agree to, is the short of it, that there's sort of an interagency conflict there. And that the funding source, which is city capital dollars, right? Capital dollars are funded by bonds, and bonds are overseen by certain regulatory authorities, which place certain requirements on the funding. It's about as straightforward an explanation as I can provide. So the key is to get rid of the strings that are attached to the funding and allow essentially DEP to use its best judgment to disperse the funds. And there are other funding sources, such as what are called expense funding, which is funding that are from our general tax dollars to the city, which are much more discretionary. So by the city and DEP committing those dollars, the expense funding, then the strings aren't attached anymore. And the strings that DEP will put on will be much more flexible to make sure that property owners are able to build green infrastructure on their buildings. So it's important to recognize that we need to build acres and thousands of acres of green infrastructure to manage our stormwater, to reduce the amount of sewage that flows into our waterways, because we have a combined system, right? Our stormwater and our potable water and our sewage water, which is combined with our stormwater, wind up in the same pipes. When it rains, we get overflows. The city is regulated to meet those, to reduce the amount of CSOs. So we have to come up with a solution, right? It's mandated. So again, in terms of progress, then we're moving in the right direction. That's a slightly longer answer to say, well, there's a why. There's a reason that the city's motivated to meet the Clean Water Act, but it's taking time for the city to recognize, oh, we really need to commit to an alternative source of funding that is more readily accessible.
We have another question here.
Hi, I'm a professor here at Queens, and I have students that really enjoy working on projects relating to green infrastructure, particularly solar and water systems. Some of those want to go on to graduate school. Are there potential funding that would support students to work on design work for specific building clusters with the owner of the building to help that owner come into the fold, to work with them, and that essentially that might be a master's or PhD project. Question is there funding that would help support that?
Jesse or Priya?
It's a tough one. You know, there are multiple. Historically, Department of Energy has had grant opportunities, as I know you know. I don't know how many more of those will be available in the near future, but DEP still has some opportunities you can apply for smaller projects. Yeah, that's, I mean, probably between NYPA, DEC, NYSERDA, there's probably something, but it would require applying for an opportunity that's out on the street at that time.
It's interesting in this, we haven't really ever mentioned the federal government, but maybe that's just as well.
Yeah, so at NYPA, we do have an ambitious internship program, and we have a department of a few dozen folks that are designing solar systems, and they rely heavily on interns to do that work through systems like CUNY's system to identify good potential candidates for renewable systems as well.
Great. Maybe one more question? Yes.
I don't mean to respond to your comment about the federal government, but I did have this question. which you can, if you choose to decline. Are there any short or long-term effects on the programs that are being implemented here locally? It sounds like it's coming from state and city. What about the change in federal policies, the attitudes towards science, the changes in federal agencies by the current administration? Is that having any effect, or can we continue on with what you've discussed?
Don't all talk
No, if you choose to decline, that's fine. I don't want to turn this conversation into something political.
Well, I think we're lucky in that in New York State we have both, and here in the city we have a governor and a mayor that have both, continued commitments, and they've not only, espoused commitments, but they're walking behind it with investments. So I think in New York we're in a different position than a lot of other states, thankfully. But that said, there are certainly programs that have been historically funded by federal funds, and those of us who have implemented those over the years have to turn our heads, to the state and the city to make sure that we can maintain those. But again, I think because it's New York State and because of the commitments that the governor and the mayor have made, we're in a much better position than so many others across the country.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Yes, I know there are more questions, and I invite our audience to come up and talk to our panelists afterwards, but I am going to have to bring this to a close here. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this morning's stimulating, informative discussion. And I want to thank all of you for coming as well. Queens College is happy to bring these informative business forums to both our college and local communities. Our next forum will be held on June 15th, 2018, when the college will host a presentation entitled Small Business is Big Business in Queens by Commissioner Greg Bishop from the Mayor's Office of Small Business Services. So please, we look forward to seeing you there. Again, if anyone wishes to give a donation, they can do so at the reception table on the way out. I hope you enjoyed this forum and would like to thank you all for coming, and also want to note that QPTV will be broadcasting this in subsequent airings, and we look forward to that schedule being announced very soon. And we look forward to seeing you at our June 15th forum. So thank you again very much for coming. Thank you.